A narrow wooden ship cuts through cold gray water, its carved prow rising and falling with the swell as dozens of armed men stand silently behind their shields. Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to follow the Vikings step by step. Not as legends wrapped in myth, but as historical actors whose raids, trade networks, and settlements reshaped large parts of Europe and beyond. We will move from their Scandinavian homelands to the coasts of England and Francia, into the rivers of Eastern Europe, across the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, and finally to the edge of North America. Over the next 2 hours, we will examine who the Vikings were, what drove them to leave their farms and fjords, how their ships made long-distance travel possible, and how they shifted from raiders to traders and settlers. We will look at specific events such as the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the formation of the Danelaw in England, the role of Viking leaders like Ragnar Lothbrok, as preserved in tradition, and historically attested rulers such as Harald Fairhair, Alfred the Great, and Leif Erikson. We will also explore their expansion into the east, where Norse groups became known as the Rus, influencing the formation of early Russian states. Few people realized that the Viking Age was not only about sudden violence along monastery walls, but also about structured trade routes connecting Baghdad to the Baltic, silver flowing north from the Islamic world, and permanent settlements that became major medieval cities. How did a society from relatively marginal lands in Scandinavia project power across such vast distances in just a few generations? That question will guide our journey. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue producing long, carefully researched historical narratives like this one. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And also, when you think of the Vikings, do you picture raiders, traders, or settlers first? Now, we begin with the world they came from. In the late 8th century, Scandinavia was not a unified political entity, but a patchwork of small kingdoms and regional chieftaincies spread across what we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The geography shaped everything. Norway's western coastline was deeply indented by fjords, creating isolated communities connected more easily by sea than by land. Denmark consisted of low-lying islands and peninsulas positioned close to the European mainland, making contact with the Frankish Empire almost inevitable. Sweden faced eastward, with river systems providing access deep into the Baltic and beyond. These environmental realities mattered because they determined patterns of trade, conflict, and expansion long before the first recorded Viking raid. Scandinavian society at this time was structured around kinship, honor, and local authority. Power rested in the hands of chieftains who controlled land, commanded loyalty, and presided over assemblies known as things, where disputes were settled and decisions made. There was no single Viking identity yet. People identified by region and allegiance rather than by a shared national consciousness. This mattered because the Viking Age was not launched by a centralized state, but by independent leaders seeking wealth, prestige, and political leverage. Their motivations were tied directly to competition within their own societies. Economically, Scandinavia was not isolated. Archaeological evidence shows trade connections with the Frankish world, the British Isles, and even the Islamic Caliphate. Long before large-scale raids began, silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate had been found in Swedish hoards, indicating established exchange networks. This mattered because it demonstrates that Vikings were already familiar with long-distance trade routes in foreign markets. Raiding did not emerge from ignorance of the outside world. It developed alongside existing commercial contacts. The same ships that carried goods could carry warriors. Technological capability was another decisive factor. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders had refined the clinker-built longship lightweight, flexible, and capable of traveling both open seas and shallow rivers. The design allowed for rapid coastal assaults and deep inland penetration via waterways. This mattered because it gave Scandinavian crews a strategic mobility that most European polities were not prepared to counter. Coastal monasteries and river settlements had little warning and few defenses against fast-moving vessels, appearing without notice. Political developments beyond Scandinavia also played a role. The expansion of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne created both pressure and opportunity. Military campaigns in northern Europe destabilized border regions, and the consolidation of power in Francia increased the concentration of wealth in monasteries and towns. Monasteries in particular accumulated precious metal objects, manuscripts, and stored goods. For ambitious Scandinavian leaders seeking resources to secure loyalty at home, these sites represented accessible targets. This mattered because Viking expansion was shaped not only by internal ambition but also by external vulnerability. By the 790s, the conditions were in place. Maritime technology capable of long-distance travel, competitive local politics, encouraging wealth acquisition, knowledge of foreign trade networks, and nearby regions rich but lightly defended. What followed was not a random explosion of violence, but the beginning of a sustained period of outward movement. The first event, recorded in detail by contemporary sources, would shock Christian Europe and mark what historians traditionally identify as the beginning of the Viking Age. We now move to that event and examine exactly what happened, why it mattered, and how it set a pattern that would define the next 2 centuries. In the year 793, a small monastic community on the island of Vinland, off the northeastern coast of what is now England, was attacked by seaborne raiders. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources described the event with alarm, recording unusual omens in the skies before reporting that heathen men miserably destroyed God's church. Lindisfarne was not chosen at random. It was a wealthy religious center, home to valuable manuscripts, liturgical objects made of precious metals, and limited defensive capacity. This mattered because it demonstrated that the attackers understood both the symbolic and material value of such targets. They were not striking aimlessly. They were targeting concentrated wealth with minimal resistance. The attackers likely came from western Norway, crossing the North Sea in longships designed for speed and coastal navigation. The distance was significant but manageable given the maritime technology already discussed. What made the raid effective was not overwhelming numbers, but surprise and mobility. Monasteries along the British coast were not fortified military structures. Their primary function was religious and scholarly, not defensive. As a result, a small, organized group of raiders could arrive, seize valuables, and depart before any coordinated response could be mounted. This mattered because it revealed a structural weakness in early medieval coastal Europe that would be exploited repeatedly. The psychological impact was greater than the immediate material loss. Lindisfarne was a respected religious institution connected to the wider Christian world. An attack on such a site was interpreted not merely as theft, but as sacrilege. Written sources emphasize the shock felt by Christian observers, framing the event as divine punishment or apocalyptic sign. This mattered because it shaped how the Vikings were recorded in history. Our earliest written accounts come from their victims, and those accounts emphasized violence and impiety rather than context or motive. The narrative of the Viking as a ruthless pagan invader began here. It is important to note that 793 was not necessarily the first Scandinavian raid in Britain. There are references to earlier incidents, including a confrontation in 789 in the Kingdom of Wessex, where foreign ships arrived and local officials were killed. However, Lindisfarne became the symbolic starting point because it was recorded clearly and because of its religious importance. This mattered because historical memory often attaches significance not only to first events, but to events that resonate symbolically with contemporary observers. The success of the raid demonstrated a workable model. Small-scale, high-impact strikes against exposed coastal targets. News of the wealth acquired would have circulated quickly within Scandinavian networks. Prestige and silver translated into political advantage at home, where chieftains competed for followers. A leader who returned with treasure could reward loyalty, secure alliances, and enhanced status. This mattered because raiding was not an isolated act of desperation. It was integrated into existing systems of power and competition. Following Lindisfarne, similar attacks were recorded along the coasts of Northumbria, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. These early operations were seasonal, conducted during favorable sailing months, with crews returning home for winter. At these stays, the Vikings were raiders rather than settlers. They struck, withdrew, and returned again. However, each successful expedition reduced the element of surprise and increased the awareness of their presence. European rulers began to recognize that this was not a one-time incident, but the beginning of a recurring pattern. The question that emerged was no longer whether Scandinavian raiders could reach these shores, but how European kingdoms would respond, and whether the Vikings themselves would remain seasonal attackers or pursue something more permanent. That transition would begin within decades. In the decades following the raid on Lindisfarne, Scandinavian attacks along the British Isles and the Frankish coasts increased in frequency and coordination. What began as isolated seasonal expeditions gradually developed into more organized campaigns. By the early 9th century, monasteries such as Iona in Ireland and settlements along the Irish and English coasts were repeatedly targeted. The pattern was consistent: approach by sea, rapid landing, seizure of movable wealth, and withdrawal before organized resistance could form. This mattered because repetition transformed isolated shock into structural instability. Coastal communities could no longer treat these raids as rare events. They became recurring threats. European rulers initially struggled to respond effectively. Local militias were slow to assemble, and communication across fragmented kingdoms was limited. In the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne had previously maintained coastal defenses, but after his death in 814, political fragmentation weakened centralized control. Viking fleets began moving up major rivers such as the Seine, Loire, and Rhine, penetrating far inland. The ability of longships to navigate shallow waters meant that cities previously considered safe were now vulnerable. This mattered because it expanded the geographic scope of danger from exposed coastlines to interior political centers. In England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex faced similar challenges. Raids intensified during the 830s and 840s, and by mid-century, Viking groups began overwintering rather than returning immediately to Scandinavia. This was a significant shift. Overwintering required logistical planning, secure encampments, and local resource extraction. It suggested longer-term intentions beyond short-term plunder. This mattered because it marked the transition from opportunistic raiding to sustained military presence. At the same time, Scandinavian society was undergoing internal change. Competition among chieftains intensified, and consolidation efforts in regions such as Norway created political pressures that encouraged outward movement. Leaders who lost power struggles at home could seek wealth and authority abroad. Additionally, younger sons in inheritance systems that favored primary heirs may have sought opportunities elsewhere. While historians debate the exact balance of push and pull factors, the cumulative effect was increased outward migration. This mattered because Viking expansion cannot be explained solely by greed. It was intertwined with domestic political dynamics. By the 850s, Viking forces were no longer limited to small raiding parties. Larger fleets, sometimes composed of multiple allied groups, coordinated operations. In 851, a Viking army overwintered on the Isle of Thanet in England. And in 856, another force wintered in Sheppey. These were not random stops. They were strategic positions, enabling control of trade routes and access to inland territories. This mattered because it demonstrated logistical sophistication and evolving objectives. The shift in scale culminated in 865 with the arrival of what sources call the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, this force aimed not merely to plunder, but to conquer and extract tribute. Led by figures associated in later tradition with Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Oba. The army targeted major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms sequentially. While the historical accuracy of every personal detail is debated, the campaign itself is well documented. This mattered because it signaled a decisive escalation. Vikings were no longer seasonal attackers, but organized military actors seeking territorial control. As European rulers adapted slowly, fortifications increased and new military strategies emerged. Yet by the time coordinated resistance strengthened, Scandinavian groups had already established footholds. The next phase would reveal how raiding evolved into occupation and governance, particularly in England, where the political landscape would be permanently altered. When the so-called Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865, the nature of Viking activity in England shifted from rapid coastal raids to sustained inland campaigns. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe a force that demanded horses, tribute, and supplies, using East Anglia as a base of operations rather than merely stripping it of valuables and leaving. This mattered because it demonstrated logistical intent, mobility on land, winter encampments, and long-term planning replaced the earlier Hitandra Thra pattern. The Vikings were now positioning themselves to dominate territory rather than simply exploit it. From East Anglia, the army moved north into Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by internal political conflict. In 866, Viking forces captured York, one of the most important urban centers in England. York, known to the Norse as Gjarvik, had Roman walls, economic significance, and strategic location. Its fall was not accidental. The Vikings capitalized on local division, defeating rival Northumbrian claimants who attempted to retake the city. This mattered because it showed that Viking success often depended on exploiting existing instability rather than overpowering unified resistance. Once York fell, it became a durable Scandinavian power center. The campaign continued into Mercia and back into East Anglia. In 869, King Edmund of East Anglia was killed after refusing to submit to Viking demands. Later Christian tradition elevated him as a martyr, reinforcing the narrative of pagan brutality. But politically the outcome was clear. Another Anglo-Saxon kingdom had collapsed under sustained pressure. This mattered because successive territorial losses revealed that the Vikings could dismantle established political systems when resistance was fragmented and slow. By the early 870s, only Wessex remained a stronghold of Anglo-Saxon independence. The Viking army advanced south, engaging in a series of battles with Wessex under King Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. Initial encounters were mixed, with both sides experiencing victories and setbacks. However, the prolonged conflict drained resources and forced adaptation. Alfred reorganized defenses, created fortified towns known as burhs, and implemented a system requiring military service tied to land. This mattered because it marked a structural response. Defense became systematic rather than reactive. In 878, after a surprise winter attack at Chippenham forced Alfred into temporary retreat, he regrouped and defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore established boundaries between Alfred's Kingdom of Wessex and Viking-controlled territories. Guthrum converted to Christianity as part of the agreement, though political necessity likely outweighed spiritual conviction. The treaty formalized what became known as the Danelaw regions of England under Scandinavian legal and political influence. This mattered because it represented the first major institutionalization of Viking rule within a large European kingdom. Under the Danelaw, Scandinavian customs, language, and legal practices shaped daily life. Place names ending in by and thorp reflect Norse settlement patterns. Trade centers such as York flourished under hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian administration, rather than constant warfare. This period saw coexistence, economic integration, and gradual cultural blending. The Vikings were no longer outsiders, attacking from the sea. They were landholders, traders, and rulers. The transformation from raiders to regional governors was not instantaneous, but it was decisive. England had become both battleground and settlement zone, and the consequences would echo for generations. The next stage would show whether this pattern of conquest and settlement remained confined to England or expanded further across Europe. By the late 9th century, the Viking presence in England had moved beyond temporary encampments and battlefield victories into structured political control. The Danelaw was not a vague frontier, but a defined region covering large portions of northern and eastern England. Within its boundaries, Scandinavian legal customs influenced dispute, resolution, land distribution, and governance. Archaeological evidence from York and surrounding settlements reveals craft production, standardized weights for trade, and a growing urban economy under Norse administration. This mattered because it demonstrates that Viking leadership was capable of transitioning from mobile warbands to stable civic management when conditions allowed. At the same time, the political landscape in Scandinavia continued to evolve. In Norway, consolidation under rulers traditionally associated with Harald Fairhair is described in later sagas, though precise historical details remain debated. What is clear is that increasing centralization created both stability and displacement. As regional rulers lost autonomy, some elites sought opportunities abroad. This outward movement reinforced the cycle of expansion already underway in England and Ireland. This mattered because developments at home and abroad were interconnected. Settlement overseas often reflected internal restructuring within Scandinavia. In England, Alfred of Wessex used the breathing space provided by the treaty with Guthrum to implement reforms that strengthened long-term resistance. The burh system created defensible urban centers linked by roads, enabling rapid troop mobilization. A reorganized military levy ensured that not all fighting men were in the field simultaneously, preserving agricultural productivity. This mattered because it introduced strategic depth to Anglo-Saxon defense. Viking forces could still attack, but they faced coordinated fortifications rather than isolated targets. The equilibrium between Wessex and the Danelaw did not eliminate conflict, but it created a more predictable frontier. Trade increased across boundaries, and intermarriage contributed to cultural blending. Old Norse words entered the English language, particularly in areas of governance, law, and everyday life. Terms such as law, sky, knife, and husband of Norse origins, reflecting integration at the societal level. This mattered because cultural influence outlasted military dominance. Even where political control shifted, linguistic and legal legacies remained embedded. Beyond England, similar patterns were unfolding. In Ireland, Vikings established long-term settlements such as Dublin, initially founded as a seasonal camp before developing into a major trading center. In Francia, Viking leaders negotiated with local rulers, most notably in 911, when Rollo was granted land in what became Normandy in exchange for loyalty and defense against further raids. This mattered because it showed that European rulers increasingly preferred incorporation over endless confrontation. Land grants converted external threats into internal stakeholders. By the early 10th century, the Viking Age had clearly evolved from sporadic raiding to structured engagement across Europe. Scandinavian groups had proven capable of violence, negotiation, trade, and governance. The model established in England arrival, pressure, conquest, settlement, and integration would influence expansions elsewhere. The question now was how far this transformation would extend, and whether the Viking network would remain focused on the British Isles or expand deeper into continental and Eastern Europe. We now move to a different frontier, where Scandinavian adventurers turned eastward and reshaped emerging political systems along the great river routes of Eastern Europe. While Viking activity in England and Francia drew the attention of Western chroniclers, another expansion was unfolding to the east from the late 8th and especially the 9th century onward. Scandinavian groups, primarily from what is now Sweden, began moving across the Baltic Sea and into the river systems of Eastern Europe. Unlike the Atlantic-facing expeditions from Norway and Denmark, this movement relied on interconnected waterways. linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. This mattered because it opened access, not just to nearby territories, but to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates, two of the most economically powerful regions of the medieval world. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Birka in Sweden shows that these eastern voyages were closely tied to trade from the outset. Birka functioned as a commercial hub, with goods moving in and out through established routes. Silver dirhams, minted under Abbasid caliphs, have been found in large quantities in Swedish hoards, sometimes cut into pieces for use as boat. This mattered because it demonstrates that Eastern expansion was deeply integrated into global trade networks. The Vikings were not entering an unknown world. They were plugging into existing economic systems stretching as far as Baghdad. The river routes were complex, but navigable with the right vessels. Scandinavian ships, used in the East, were often smaller than ocean-going longships, designed to be dragged over short portages. Between rivers, from the Gulf of Vinland, crews could travel along the Neva River to Ladoga, then south via the Volkhov River to Ligil, and onward through the Dnieper River system toward the Black Sea. Another route followed the Valga River to the Caspian Sea. This mattered because it required not only maritime skill but geographical knowledge and coordination with local populations who controlled sections of these routes. The people encountered along these waterways included Slavic tribes, Finno-Greek groups, and steppe nomads, such as the Khazars. Scandinavian traders and warriors did not simply overpower these populations. They formed alliances, extracted tribute, and sometimes integrated into local political hierarchies. Byzantine and Arab sources refer to these Norse groups as Rus. The exact origin of the term is debated, but many scholars associate it with the Scandinavian root related to rowing. This mattered because it indicates that outsiders recognized these northern traders as a distinct, organized presence rather than scattered raiders. One of the earliest semi-legendary figures associated with this eastern expansion is traditionally said to have been invited by local Slavic groups to rule in Novgorod around 862. The primary source for this account is the Primary Chronicle, compiled centuries later, and historians debate its precise reliability. However, archaeological findings confirm Scandinavian presence in key settlements such as Novgorod and Staraya Ladoga. During this period, this mattered because it suggests that Scandinavian elites did establish ruling positions within emerging eastern polities, even if the exact narrative details remain uncertain. Unlike the sudden shock of Lindisfarne, the eastern expansion was gradual and commercially driven. Trade in furs, honey, wax, and enslaved people moved southward, while silver and luxury goods flowed north. The Dnieper route, in particular, connected the Baltic world to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This mattered because it positioned the Vikings not merely as regional actors, but as participants in a transcontinental economic system. As these networks strengthened, Scandinavian groups in the east began to transition from mobile traders to territorial rulers. The foundations were being laid for political entities that would eventually evolve into the medieval state of Kievan Rus. The next phase will show how these northern adventurers secured their authority and negotiated power with some of the most sophisticated empires of their time. As Scandinavian groups moved deeper into the river systems of Eastern Europe during the 9th century, their role evolved from itinerant traders into power brokers, embedded within local political structures. This shift did not occur overnight, and it did not follow a single uniform pattern. Instead, it emerged gradually from the practical necessities of controlling trade routes, protecting caravans, negotiating with local tribes, and extracting tribute. Control of a river junction or fortified settlement translated directly into economic leverage. And economic leverage could be converted into political authority. This mattered because sustained access to wealth required stability, and stability often required rule. Archaeological evidence from settlements such as Staraya, Ladoga, and Novgorod shows the presence of Scandinavian-style burials, weaponry, jewelry, and housing patterns alongside Slavic material culture. These sites were not exclusively Norse colonies. They were mixed communities. This mattered because it indicates integration rather than simple domination. Scandinavian elites may have controlled key positions, but they operated within multi-ethnic societies where cooperation was necessary for long-distance trade to function effectively. The economic system depended on local producers supplying furs, agricultural goods, and other commodities that could be transported south. The Volga trade route, in particular, connected Scandinavian merchants with the Islamic world. Arab geographers such as Ibn Fadlan described encounters with the Rus along the Volga in the early 10th century. His account, written in 921 to 922, provides one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of these northern traders. He observed their physical appearance, commercial practices, and funerary customs, including a ship burial accompanied by human sacrifice. While some details reflect his own cultural perspective, the overall record confirms that Scandinavian groups were active participants in trade, reaching as far as the Abbasids. This mattered because it provides external corroboration of the scale and organization of Viking activity in the East. At the same time, relations with the Byzantine Empire intensified. The Dnieper route enabled Scandinavian-led groups to reach Constantinople, known to the Norse as Byzantine records document both trade agreements and violent confrontations between the Empire and Rus forces. In 860, a Rus fleet reportedly attacked Constantinople, though details vary across sources. This mattered because it demonstrates that Eastern expansion, like Western expansion, combined commerce and coercion. Trade partnerships could coexist with military pressure. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, a political center emerged around Kiev. Under leaders traditionally associated with the Rurikid dynasty, Oleg of Novgorod, described in the primary chronicle as a successor to Rurik, is said to have moved south and seized Kiev around 882, establishing it as a central seat of power. While historians debate the precise chronology, there is strong consensus that Kiev became a focal point of a growing polity, linking Baltic and Black Sea trade. This mattered because it consolidated scattered trading posts into a more coherent political entity, capable of negotiating treaties and organizing military campaigns. In 907 and 911, treaties between the Rus and Byzantium were recorded, outlining trade privileges and legal protections for Rus merchants in Constantinople. These agreements were detailed and formal, specifying conditions of residence and dispute resolution. This mattered because it indicates recognition. The Byzantine Empire, one of the most sophisticated states of the medieval world, treated the Rus as organized representatives of a political structure rather than as mere pirates. Diplomatic acknowledgments signaled maturity of governance. The transformation underway in Eastern Europe differed from developments in England, but the underlying mechanism was similar. Mobility led to wealth. Wealth enabled authority. Authority required administration. As Scandinavian elites embedded themselves into Slavic majority regions, cultural exchange intensified. Language, religion, and law began to evolve in response to this hybrid environment. The next stage would reveal how these emerging Eastern polities balanced their Scandinavian roots with local identities and external pressures from powerful neighboring states. As the political center of power shifted toward Kiev in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the emerging Rus polity faced the challenge of sustaining authority across vast and diverse territories. Control depended on more than military strength. The river routes linking the Baltic to the Black Sea were long and vulnerable, passing through territories inhabited by Slavic agricultural communities, Finno-Ugric groups, and steppe peoples such as the Pek. Maintaining revenue required organized tribute collection and predictable trade conditions. This mattered because economic continuity was the foundation of political survival. Without steady movement of goods and silver, elite authority would fracture quickly. The leadership structure of early Kievan Rus appears to have combined Scandinavian warrior traditions with local administrative practices. Rulers such as Oleg and later Igor are described in the primary chronicle as conducting annual tribute-gathering expeditions known as paladi, during which they traveled through subordinate territories collecting goods and enforcing loyalty. While the chronicle was compiled in the early 12th century and must be treated cautiously, its descriptions align with patterns of early medieval rulership elsewhere. This mattered because it reflects a transitional system in which mobile leadership gradually adapted to more settled governance. Tribute collection required negotiation, threat, and reciprocity, not constant warfare. The assassination of Prince Igor around 945, reportedly killed by the Drevlians during a tribute dispute, exposed the instability of this system. According to tradition, Igor's widow, Olga, responded with calculated retaliation and later administrative reform. While some elements of her revenge narrative are stylized, there is strong evidence that reforms followed. Fixed tribute stations were reportedly established, reducing arbitrary collection and stabilizing relations between rulers and subject populations. This mattered because institutionalization replaced improvisation. A more predictable fiscal structure strengthened central authority and reduced the risk of rebellion. Interaction with Byzantium intensified during this period. Military campaigns against Constantinople alternated with negotiated agreements. Rus warriors also entered Byzantine service as members of the Varangian Guard, an elite unit composed largely of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon fighters. This mattered because it created dual channels of engagement, confrontation, and cooperation. Service in Constantinople provided wealth and prestige, and returning veterans brought both silver and foreign influence back to Rus territories. The relationship was not purely adversarial, it was transactional and strategic. Religious transformation became another structural turning point. While early Rus elites practiced forms of Norse paganism, contact with Christian Byzantium introduced alternative models of legitimacy. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev adopted Christianity in its Byzantine form and initiated the Christianization of his realm. Sources differ on the precise motivations: political alliance, internal consolidation, or genuine conviction. But the outcome is clear. This mattered because religious conversion integrated Kievan Rus into the broader Christian diplomatic network of Eastern Europe and Byzantium. It also distanced the polity from its explicitly Scandinavian pagan origins. The conversion had administrative consequences. Literacy expanded through the introduction of church structures. An ecclesiastical organization supported centralized authority. Cultural identity shifted as Norse influence blended into Slavic majority traditions. Over time, the Scandinavian ruling elite assimilated linguistically and socially. By the 11th century, the Rus were no longer perceived primarily as foreign Norse adventurers, but as a distinct East Slavic polity. This mattered because it illustrates how Viking expansion could culminate not in perpetual foreign dominance, but in absorption and transformation. The eastern trajectory of Viking activity thus demonstrates a pattern parallel to developments in England, but with different outcomes. In the West, Scandinavian settlements retained clearer linguistic imprints within English society. In the East, Scandinavian identity gradually dissolved into emerging Slavic states. The next phase will consolidate this transformation and assess how the Rus balanced external pressures while maintaining control over one of the most important trade corridors of the medieval world. By the early 11th century, the polity centered on Kiev had become one of the largest and most economically significant states in Europe. Its territory stretched from the Baltic region in the north to the steppes near the Black Sea in the south, connecting forests, river, and steppe economies into a unified tribute and trade system. This scale mattered because it marked the culmination of 2 centuries of Scandinavian movement eastward. What began as small trading ventures had matured into a structured realm capable of diplomacy, warfare, taxation, and succession. The Viking imprint was now embedded within a new political identity. Under rulers such as Yaroslav the Wise, who reigned from 1019 to 1054. Kievan Rus reached administrative and cultural consolidation. Legal codes such as the Ruskaya Pravda were compiled, outlining penalties, property rights, and procedures for resolving disputes. While not purely Scandinavian in origin, these laws reflected the hybrid character of the state, combining Norse traditions of compensation-based justice with Slavic customary practices and Christian legal influence. This mattered because codified law signaled stable governance. A society that can formalize rules is no longer dependent solely on personal authority or force. Trade remains central. Silver from the Islamic world continued to flow northward, though patterns shifted as political conditions changed. Fur exports, agricultural goods, wax, and enslaved individuals moved through established channels. Kiev functioned as a redistribution hub, coordinating river traffic and ensuring security along key routes. The Dnieper Rapids posed physical challenges, requiring coordinated portage and protection from steppe nomads remained a constant concern. This mattered because maintaining trade infrastructure required both military readiness and administrative oversight. Economic strength could not be sustained without territorial control. At the same time, the distinctly Scandinavian identity that had characterized early Rus elites gradually diminished. Intermarriage with Slavic populations, adoption of the Slavic language, and integration into Christian Europe reshaped elite culture. Dynastic marriages connected Kievan princes to royal families across Europe, including alliances with France, Hungary, and Scandinavia itself. This mattered because it signaled normalization. The Rus were no longer perceived as foreign traders from the north, but as established European rulers participating in continental politics. External pressures, however, persisted. Steppe incursions, particularly from the Pechenegs, and later the Cumans, required defensive mobilization. Internal succession disputes fragmented authority over time. By the mid-11th century, the centralized cohesion achieved under earlier rulers began to weaken. This mattered because it reveals the limits of early medieval state formation. The structures built upon Viking-era expansion were durable but not immune to the centrifugal forces of dynastic competition and regional autonomy. The Eastern expansion illustrates a broader pattern of Viking activity. Mobility leading to opportunity, opportunity leading to settlement, and settlement leading to political transformation. In this case, the Scandinavian contribution became foundational to a new Slavic Christian state whose legacy would influence the later histories of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Yet while Eastern developments reshaped vast territories, Viking expansion was not confined to rivers and continental trade routes. Another frontier lay across the open Atlantic, where maritime skill would carry Scandinavian settlers into some of the most remote environments of the medieval world. We now shift from the river corridors of Eastern Europe to the North Atlantic, where migration rather than conquest would define the next major phase of Viking expansion. By the late 9th century, Scandinavian expansion turned decisively toward the North Atlantic. Unlike the eastern river routes or the militarized campaigns in England, this movement was driven primarily by migration and settlement. The destination was Iceland, a large volcanic island located between Norway and Greenland, largely uninhabited at the time of Norse arrival, except possibly for small groups of Irish monks, though firm archaeological evidence for permanent pre-Norse settlement remains limited. This mattered because Iceland offered something increasingly scarce in Norway: available land beyond the reach of consolidating royal authority. The traditional starting point for Icelandic settlement is dated to around 874, when Angulfur Arnarsson is said to have established a homestead in what became Reykjavik. The primary source for these events is the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, compiled in the medieval period based on earlier oral traditions. While exact details are debated, archaeological findings confirm a wave of Scandinavian migration to Iceland beginning in the late 9th century. This mattered because it aligns documentary tradition with material evidence, supporting the conclusion that Iceland became a major Norse settlement zone within a few decades. The The political context in Norway contributed directly to this migration. The consolidation of power under Harald Fairhair, whether gradual or concentrated, reduced the autonomy of regional chiefs. Some elites who resisted centralization chose exile over submission. Relocating to Iceland allowed them to re-establish authority in a land without a king. This mattered because Icelandic settlement was not merely economic expansion. It was also a political alternative. Migrants sought independence from emerging monarchy and the opportunity to recreate social structures on new territory. The environment of Iceland presented both opportunity and challenge. The island offered pastureland suitable for sheep and cattle, as well as coastal resources such as fish and seabirds. However, the climate was harsh, the growing season short, and arable land limited. Settlers established dispersed farmsteads rather than centralized towns, adapting Scandinavian agricultural practices to new conditions. Timber was scarce, requiring reliance on driftwood and turf construction. This mattered because survival depended on flexibility. Migration was not guaranteed success. It required adjustment to environmental constraints. Social organization in Iceland followed familiar Scandinavian patterns. Power rested with local chieftains, known as Gogar, who maintained authority through alliances and assemblies. However, unlike Norway, Iceland developed without a centralized monarchy. Around 930, settlers established the Alþingi, a general assembly that met annually at Ling. The Alþingi functioned as both legislative and judicial body, resolving disputes and standardizing laws. This mattered because it represented one of the earliest parliamentary institutions in Europe, reflecting a collective solution to governance in the absence of a king. Settlement proceeded rapidly between roughly 870 and 930, a period known as the Land. By the mid-10th century, most viable farmland had been claimed. Genealogies preserved in Icelandic sources suggest that settlers came primarily from western Norway, with some contributions from the British Isles, including individuals of Gaelic origin. This matters because it highlights the interconnected nature of Viking expansion. Migration to Iceland was linked to prior activity in Scotland and Ireland. The establishment of Iceland demonstrated that Viking mobility could lead to durable, self-governing societies rather than temporary camps or foreign dominion. Yet Iceland was not the final frontier. As population pressures increased and ambition persisted, some settlers looked even farther west into colder and more uncertain waters. The next phase would test the limits of Norse maritime capability and environmental endurance. By the late 10th century, Iceland itself began to experience internal pressures that encouraged further westward movement. Land suitable for farming had largely been claimed, and social tensions among prominent families occasionally escalated into feuds. One of the most significant figures associated with the next phase of expansion was Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red. According to Icelandic sagas, Erik was outlawed from Iceland around 982 after involvement in violent disputes. Exile in Norse legal tradition meant loss of protection and forced departure. This mattered because legal structures could directly trigger exploration. Outlawry created incentives to seek new territories beyond existing jurisdictions. Erik sailed west and encountered a vast landmass that had been sighted earlier but not settled permanently. He spent several years exploring its coastline before returning to Iceland to recruit settlers. He named the region Greenland, a term likely chosen to make the territory appear more attractive to potential migrants. The name was strategic marketing. While parts of southern Greenland offered limited pasture during milder climatic conditions of the medieval warm period, much of the island was inhospitable. This mattered because Norse expansion was not blind optimism. It involved deliberate persuasion and calculated risk. In 985 or 986, a fleet of approximately 25 ships departed Iceland for Greenland. Sources suggest that fewer than 15 completed the journey, with others lost or turned back due to storms. Those who arrived established two primary settlements: the eastern settlement near present-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement farther north. These were not large urban centers. but dispersed farming communities relying on livestock, limited agriculture, hunting, and trade. This mattered because Greenland represented the outer boundary of sustainable Norse agrarian society. Survival required adaptation to marginal environmental conditions. The Greenland settlements depended heavily on trade with Iceland and Norway. Walrus ivory, a valuable commodity in medieval Europe, became a principal export. Walrus tusks were used in luxury goods and ecclesiastical art. This mattered because Greenland's viability was tied to European demand. Without consistent trade routes bringing timber, iron, and other essentials from Scandinavia, the colonies would struggle. Isolation was a structural vulnerability. Christianity also reached Greenland, following Iceland's formal conversion around the year 1000. Churches were built, and the settlements became integrated into the ecclesiastical network of medieval Scandinavia. Bishops were eventually appointed to Greenland, reflecting institutional recognition. This mattered because it demonstrates that even remote colonies remained connected to broader political and religious systems. Greenland was not an independent outpost, but part of a larger Norse Christian world. However, environmental and economic pressures accumulated over time. The climate gradually cooled after the medieval warm period, shortening growing seasons and reducing pasture reliability. Soil erosion from overgrazing further weakened agricultural productivity. Meanwhile, European demand for walrus ivory declined as elephant ivory became more accessible through other trade routes. This mattered because Greenland's economic model was fragile. When trade value declined and climatic conditions worsened, resilience diminished. Despite these challenges, the Greenland settlements endured for several centuries. Their survival demonstrates the outer limit of Viking expansion based on farming and maritime trade. Yet some Greenlanders pushed exploration even farther west, beyond known boundaries, seeking timber and possibly new lands for settlement. The next stage will examine these voyages and assess the historical evidence for Norse presence in North America. The movement from Greenland to lands farther west occurred within a generation of the initial settlement. According to the Icelandic sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, a merchant named Bjarni Hergalfsson was blown off course around the year 986. While sailing from Iceland to Greenland, he reported sighting unknown lands to the west but did not go ashore. His account later inspired further exploration. This mattered because Norse discovery of North America appears to have resulted from navigational accident combined with deliberate follow-up expeditions. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, is traditionally credited with leading the first successful Norse landing in North America around the year 1000. According to saga tradition, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and retraced the reported route. The sagas describe three regions encountered: Helluland, likely corresponding to Baffin Island; Markland, probably Labrador; and Vinland, whose exact location remains debated but is widely associated with Newfoundland. This mattered because the progression suggests systematic exploration rather than random drifting. Norse navigators were mapping coastlines step by step. The most significant archaeological evidence supporting Norse presence in North America comes from Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland. Excavations conducted in the 1960s revealed turf structures, iron nails, and artifacts consistent with Norse construction techniques and metallurgy dating to around the year 1000. This matters because it confirms that the sagas, though written centuries later, preserve a core of historical reality. The Norse did establish at least one temporary settlement in North America. However, the evidence also indicates that this settlement was short-lived. Lonzo Meadows appears to have functioned as a seasonal base rather than a permanent colony. The sagas describe encounters with indigenous peoples referred to as likely representing ancestors of Inuit or other native groups. These encounters reportedly involved trade as well as conflict. While saga details vary and may contain embellishment, the broader pattern suggests tension and logistical difficulty. This mattered because successful colonization required more than landfall. It required sustainable integration or dominance, neither of which the Norse achieved in North America. Resource motivation likely drove these voyages. Greenland lacked sufficient timber for large-scale construction, and Markland, in particular, was described as forested. Expeditions may have focused on acquiring lumber and other materials rather than establishing mass migration. This mattered because it reframes Vinland, not as a failed empire but as a strategic extension of Greenland's supply network. Once the costs and risks outweighed the benefits, regular voyages diminished. Distance also imposed constraints. The route from Greenland to Newfoundland was challenging and exposed to unpredictable weather. Maintaining consistent communication and supply across such distances required manpower and stable political support. Unlike England or Ireland, North America offered no dense agricultural base or existing trade network to integrate into. This mattered because Viking expansion thrived where it could connect to established economic systems. In North America, such integration was limited. By the early 11th century, Norse activity in Vinland appears to have ceased. While sporadic voyages for timber may have continued, there is no evidence of enduring settlement. The attempt nonetheless demonstrates the maximum geographic reach of Viking exploration, extending from the rivers of Russia to the coasts of North America. The next phase will examine how these far-reaching expansions ultimately converged into a broader transformation of Scandinavian society itself. By the early 11th century, the North Atlantic network linking Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and brief ventures to North America represented one of the most geographically expansive maritime systems in medieval Europe. What had begun as localized migration from Norway to Iceland had evolved into a chain of settlements spanning thousands of kilometers. This mattered because it demonstrated the outer operational capacity of Viking long-distance navigation without centralized imperial infrastructure. These communities were connected not by standing armies or bureaucratic administration, but by kinship ties, trade exchanges, shared law, and seasonal voyages. Iceland solidified its internal structure during this period. The Alþingi continued to function as a central assembly, standardizing law and mediating disputes among chiefs. Around the year 1000, Iceland formally adopted Christianity after a decision taken at the Alþingi, reportedly to prevent internal division between pagan and Christian factions. This mattered because it reflected pragmatic governance. Religious conversion was framed as a collective decision designed to preserve social stability rather than as the result of conquest. It also aligned Iceland more closely with Norway and continental Europe, integrating it into wider ecclesiastical and diplomatic systems. Greenland settlements, meanwhile, reached their peak between the 11th and early 13th centuries. Churches were constructed, and episcopal authority was established, indicating institutional continuity. Trade with Norway remained essential, though increasingly vulnerable to shifting political and climatic conditions. As European demand patterns changed, and sea routes became less predictable due to cooling temperatures, Greenland's economic foundation weakened. This mattered because remote colonies depend heavily on external trade stability. When connections fray, resilience declines rapidly. The Vinland venture did not evolve into permanent expansion, and its limited scope underscores an important structural reality. Viking success depended on identifiable incentives, accessible wealth, exploitable trade networks, arable land, or political fragmentation in target regions. In North America, while resources such as timber were available, the absence of dense trade networks and the presence of organized indigenous communities limited prospects for sustained settlement. This mattered because Viking expansion was opportunistic, but not unlimited. It followed rational calculations of cost and benefit. By the mid-11th century, attention increasingly shifted back towards Scandinavia itself. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden experienced intensified political consolidation. Monarchies strengthened, administrative systems expanded, and integration into Christian Europe accelerated. The Viking Age, defined by outward mobility and decentralized initiative, began to give way to a more state-centered era. This mattered because external expansion and internal consolidation are often inversely related. As Scandinavian kingdoms centralized, the conditions that had fueled independent raiding and migration gradually diminished. The North Atlantic settlements endured in varying forms, but the broader pattern of Viking-driven exploration slowed. Iceland remained viable as an agrarian society, while Greenland's colonies eventually disappeared by the 5th-10th century under combined environmental and economic pressures. The arc of expansion had reached its limits. What began as raiding across the North Sea had evolved into trade empires, hybrid status, and remote colonies, only to stabilize into more conventional medieval kingdoms. We now move from the frontiers of expansion to the transformation within Scandinavia itself, where the legacy of 2 centuries of movement reshaped political authority, religion, and identity across the Norse world. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the societies that had launched waves of raids, trade expeditions, and settlements were themselves undergoing structural transformation. Scandinavia was no longer a landscape dominated solely by independent chieftains competing for regional influence. Instead, centralized monarchies began consolidating authority in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This mattered because the political fragmentation that had enabled flexible, independent Viking expeditions gradually gave way to royal control, taxation, and institutional governance. The internal reorganization of power directly affected the capacity and motivation for external raiding. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled in the mid to late 10th century, played a decisive role in unifying territories and promoting Christianity. Runestones attributed to Harald the Clee that he made the Danes Christian and unified Denmark. While conversion was not immediate or universal, royal endorsement of Christianity aligned Denmark more closely with continental Europe. This mattered because religious integration reinforced diplomatic ties and reduced the ideological divide that had once framed Viking raids as pagan incursions against Christian lands. Christian kings were less inclined to sanction widespread attacks on fellow Christian realms. In Norway, consolidation occurred through a series of rulers who sought to extend authority over regional chief Olaf Tryggvason and later Olaf Haraldsson, known as Saint Olaf, pursued aggressive Christianization policies and strengthened royal control. Resistance from local elites was significant, and civil conflict accompanied these reforms. This mattered because centralization did not occur smoothly. It required suppression of rival power bases. As monarchies strengthened, private warbands operating independently abroad became harder to sustain without royal approval. Sweden followed a somewhat slower path toward centralization, but Christian influence and royal authority expanded there as well. The shift toward monarchic governance introduced new administrative demands, including the collection of taxes and the maintenance of standing forces loyal to the crown. This mattered because it reoriented martial energy inward, toward state building rather than outward raiding. Viking expeditions had often been organized by ambitious local leaders seeking prestige. Under centralized monarchy, such initiatives were increasingly subordinated to royal priorities. Christianization played a central structural role in this transformation. Conversion was not purely theological. It carried legal and diplomatic consequences. Integration into the European Christian network opened trade privileges, ecclesiastical support, and dynastic marriage opportunities. It also introduced written administration, expanding the use of Latin literacy within clerical contexts. This mattered because written record-keeping enhanced bureaucratic governance and reduced reliance on oral tradition alone. Institutional continuity became more stable under literate administration. Economic patterns also shifted. As Scandinavian rulers gained control over trade routes and ports, they could regulate commerce more systematically. Urban centers such as Rib, Hedeby, and later Oslo and Stockholm developed into structured trading towns. Coin minting increased under royal authority, replacing the earlier reliance on foreign silver bullion. This mattered because standardized currency and regulated markets reflected mature economic systems, less dependent on raiding for wealth accumulation. The cumulative effect of political consolidation, Christian and administrative reform was a narrowing of the conditions that had defined the Viking Age. Raiding did not disappear immediately, but it was no longer the dominant outward expression of Scandinavian society. Expansion began to take the form of dynastic alliances, crusading activity in the Baltic, and integration into European feudal structures. The next phase will examine how these changes altered Scandinavian identity and redefined what it meant to be a Viking in a world increasingly governed by kings and church institutions. As royal authority strengthened across Scandinavia in the late 10th and 11th centuries, legal and economic structures evolved in ways that directly undermined the decentralized raiding model that had defined earlier generations. Under the earlier chieftain-based system, wealth acquisition through overseas expeditions enhanced local prestige and reinforced personal loyalty networks. However, under emerging monarchies, authority became tied to territorial control, taxation, and ecclesiastical legitimacy. This mattered because political power was no longer derived primarily from distributing plunder, but from administering land and maintaining order within defined borders. Legal codification expanded during this period. Regional law codes began to be recorded in writing, drawing on older oral traditions, but incorporating Christian legal principles. These codes addressed property rights, inheritance, trade regulations, and penalties for violence. While not eliminating conflict, they reduced the frequency of feud-based retaliation that had characterized earlier Norse society. This mattered because formalized legal processes strengthened central authority and diminished the need for private war bands seeking compensation through external violence. The state increasingly claimed a monopoly on legitimate force. Economic transformation reinforced this shift. Scandinavian rulers began minting their own coinage in greater quantities, replacing reliance on imported silver dirhams or hacked bullion. Monetary circulation facilitated taxation and market exchange under royal oversight. Urban centers such as Lundaroskilde and Trondheim expanded as administrative and commercial hubs. These towns functioned not only as trade markets but also as seats of episcopal authority and royal governance. This mattered because concentrated urban development signaled structural stability. Wealth could be generated through regulated commerce rather than through unpredictable raiding expeditions. Internationally, Scandinavian kingdoms integrated into European diplomatic networks. Dynastic marriages connected royal houses to England, Normandy, and other continental realms. For example, King Canute of Denmark ruled England in the early 11th century, creating a North Sea empire that linked Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon territories. This mattered because expansion through dynastic union replaced expansion through opportunistic raiding. Political ambition persisted, but its mechanisms changed. Authority became institutional rather than purely martial. Christianization also reshaped cultural identity. Churches were constructed throughout Scandinavia, and ecclesiastical hierarchies reported to archbishoprics in continental Europe. The church promoted literacy, record-keeping, and standardized moral codes. Practices such as slavery and human sacrifice, previously embedded in Norse tradition, were gradually restricted or eliminated under Christian influence. This mattered because religious alignment with Europe reduced ideological justification for attacks on Christian communities abroad. Raiding fellow Christian territories became politically and spiritually complicated. Military organization did not disappear, but it became structured under royal command. Naval levies were organized to defend coasts or participate in sanctioned campaigns, such as later crusading expeditions in the Baltic. These operations differed fundamentally from earlier Viking raids. They were framed as state actions with defined objectives, rather than as independent ventures seeking immediate plunder. This mattered because it reflects a transition from entrepreneurial warfare to institutionalized military service. By the mid-11th century, the conditions that had fueled large-scale Viking raiding, political fragmentation, decentralized authority, and reliance on prestige-based wealth distribution had largely diminished within Scandinavia itself. While Norse descendants remained active across Europe, The internal engine driving the Viking Age was losing momentum. The next phase will examine how this transformation affected Scandinavian identity and how later generations remembered the era of expansion. As the 11th century progressed, and Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated into stable Christian monarchies, the memory of the earlier Viking Age began to shift. The generation that had launched raids on Lindisfarne or settled Iceland was no longer in power. Instead, rulers sought legitimacy not through plunder but through dynastic continuity, Christian endorsement, and administrative order. This mattered because collective identity evolves with political structure. When institutions change, narratives about the past are reshaped to support the present. One of the most significant developments in this process was the recording of sagas and historical narratives in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries. Works such as Heimskringla and various Icelandingaska preserve stories of earlier Norwegian kings, explorers, and warriors. These texts were written centuries after many of the events they describe, drawing on oral tradition. While they contain legendary embellishments, they also preserve valuable historical frameworks. This mattered because the Viking Age was not forgotten, it was curated. The past was organized into structured stories that balanced heroism, conflict, and moral reflection within a Christian literary context. In these narratives, figures such as Harald Fairhair, Olaf Tryggvason, and Eric the Red were portrayed not merely as raiders but as foundational actors in the formation of kingdoms and communities. Violence remained present in the storytelling, but it was contextualized within broader arcs of settlement, conversion, and state formation. This mattered because it reframed Viking activity as a stage in national development rather than as isolated lawlessness. The era of expansion became a precursor to legitimate monarchy rather than an embarrassment to be erased. Legal and administrative continuity reinforced this reinterpretation. Law codes compiled in Norway and Iceland emphasized order, property rights, and Christian norms, while earlier generations might have gained prestige through overseas expeditions. Later, elites derived authority from landholding and recognized titles. The social incentives shifted. Ambitious young men were more likely to pursue advancement through royal service or ecclesiastical office than through unsanctioned raiding. This mattered because identity follows opportunity. When structures reward stability, cultural values adjust accordingly. Economic integration with Europe further altered perception. Scandinavian merchants operated within established trade networks, connecting the Baltic, the North Sea, and continental markets. Participation in the Hanseatic League in later centuries demonstrated how northern economies adapted to cooperative commercial frameworks rather than predatory expansion. This mattered because economic interdependence discourages indiscriminate aggression. As trade became institutionalized, the incentives for coastal raiding declined sharply. Military culture persisted, but its orientation changed. Scandinavian forces participated in crusading campaigns in the Baltic region during the 12th century, framed explicitly as Christian missions against pagan groups. These campaigns differed fundamentally from earlier Viking raids. They were justified by religious ideology aligned with continental Europe and coordinated under royal and ecclesiastical authority. This mattered because it illustrates the complete inversion of identity. Former pagan raiders became Christian crusaders, operating within the same ideological structure they once challenged. By the end of the 11th century, the term Viking itself was less a contemporary label than a retrospective one. In Old Norse usage, Viking originally referred to someone engaged in overseas expeditions, not an ethnic identity. As the practice declined, the label became historical rather than descriptive. The next phase will examine how this transformation culminated in the formal end of the Viking Age, and how later historical milestones symbolically closed the era of expansion. By the mid-11th century, historians generally identify the end of the Viking Age, not because Scandinavian activity abroad ceased entirely, but because the structural conditions that had defined the period fundamentally changed. One symbolic marker often cited is the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada invaded England, and was defeated by King Harold Godwinson. This mattered because Hardrada's campaign resembled earlier Viking-style expeditions. A Scandinavian ruler attempting to assert power overseas through force. His defeat signaled that such large-scale ventures were no longer viable under the evolving political landscape of Europe. Only weeks after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy invaded England and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. William himself was a descendant of Norse settlers who had established Normandy in 911 under Rollo. This mattered because it illustrates continuity and transformation simultaneously. The Viking legacy persisted, but in altered form. Norman rulers were culturally French, Christian, and integrated into feudal Europe. Even though their distant origins traced back to Scandinavian settlers, expansion now occurred within feudal and dynastic frameworks rather than through independent raiding fleets. In Scandinavia, monarchies had consolidated enough authority to maintain internal order and project power through institutional means. Royal taxation systems, church alliances, and codified law created predictable governance. Maritime skill remained strong, but its primary function shifted toward commerce, royal campaigns, and regulated naval defense. The independence-seeking model, in which leaders assembled crews for personal ventures abroad, diminished significantly. This mattered because centralized authority reduces the space for autonomous warfare. The Christianization process further solidified the shift. By the late 11th century, Scandinavia was fully integrated into Latin Christendom. Bishops operated under recognized archbishoprics, and ecclesiastical courts addressed moral and legal disputes. The Church promoted literacy and record-keeping, embedding Scandinavian kingdoms within European intellectual and diplomatic networks. This mattered because shared religious identity aligned Scandinavia with neighboring realms that had once been targets. Raiding Christian Europe no longer carried ideological or political advantage. Economic priorities reinforced this transformation. Stable trade routes across the Baltic and North Sea generated consistent wealth without the risks associated with plunder. Urban centers expanded as nodes of exchange, and coinage standardized transactions. Maritime expertise now supported commerce linking Scandinavia with the British Isles, Germany, and beyond. This mattered because sustainable prosperity reduced reliance on unpredictable expeditions. Economic rationality favored trade agreements over violent extraction. The cumulative effect of political consolidation, Christian integration, and economic stabilization was the dissolution of the Viking Age as a distinct historical phase. Scandinavian societies remained influential, but their influence operated through recognized state structures rather than decentralized warrior bands. The identity of Viking transitioned from lived reality to historical memory. What had begun in the late 8th century with coastal raids and river expeditions concluded in the 11th century, with established kingdoms integrated into medieval Europe. The story, however, is not complete without examining the long-term consequences of Viking expansion beyond Scandinavia. The next act will assess how Viking activity permanently altered the regions they touched, from England and Normandy to Eastern Europe and the North Atlantic settlements. By the time the Viking Age formally concluded in the mid-11th century, England had been transformed politically, linguistically, and institutionally by nearly 3 centuries of Scandinavian interaction. The initial raids had destabilized coastal regions, but the establishment of the Danelaw created structural changes that endured long after Viking rule receded. This mattered because Viking influence in England was not a temporary interruption. It became embedded in governance, settlement patterns, and language. The Danelaw introduced Scandinavian legal customs that coexisted with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Regional assemblies operated under modified rules, and certain legal terms of Old Norse origin became integrated into English usage. The word law itself derives from Old Norse lagu, reflecting this influence. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite mark areas of densest Scandinavian settlement, particularly in Yorkshire and the East Midlands. This mattered because toponyms serve as durable evidence of demographic change. Even after political authority shifted, the settlement footprint remained visible in the landscape. The reign of King Canute in the early 11th century represented the height of Scandinavian political integration in England. Canute ruled not as an external raider, but as a recognized king within the Anglo-Saxon administrative system. He maintained existing institutions while strengthening ties to Denmark and Norway. This mattered because it demonstrated that Scandinavian rulers could govern effectively within established frameworks rather than dismantling them. The North Sea Empire under Canute linked England and Scandinavia economically and politically, creating a trans-regional network based on shared monarchy rather than plunder. After 1066, Norman rule further blended Scandinavian heritage with continental feudal structures. The Normans themselves descended from Norse settlers granted land in northern France. Their invasion of England brought administrative reforms, castle building, and feudal land tenure. While Norman identity was distinct from earlier Viking groups, the continuity is significant. This mattered because Viking expansion indirectly shaped the political evolution of England twice, first through direct settlement and later through Norman conquest rooted in earlier Norse migration. Linguistically, the interaction between Old Norse and Old English had lasting consequences. Because the two languages were related Germanic tongues, mutual intelligibility was partial, allowing for borrowing and blending. Common everyday words such as sky, egg, knife, and husband entered English from Norse. Even grammatical simplifications in Middle English may have been influenced by bilingual communities in Danelaw regions. This mattered because language change reflects sustained coexistence rather than superficial contact. Institutionally, Viking pressure prompted defensive innovation. Alfred's burst system laid groundwork for urban development, and military reorganization strengthened centralized authority in Wessex. The need to respond to Viking incursions accelerated state formation. This matters because external threat often catalyzes internal reform. England's eventual emergence as a unified kingdom was shaped in part by the necessity of coordinated resistance. The Viking imprint on England was therefore structural rather than episodic. Raids initiated the process, settlement consolidated it, and political integration embedded it. The next phase would examine how similar patterns unfolded in continental Europe, particularly in Francia and the Baltic region, where Viking interaction reshaped political and economic systems in different but equally lasting ways. While England experienced direct conquest and settlement, the Frankish territories to the south encountered Viking expansion through a combination of repeated raids and negotiated incorporation. From the early 9th century, Viking fleets sailed up major rivers such as the Seine and Loire, attacking towns including Rouen and even Paris. The Siege of Paris in 845, led by a Viking force traditionally associated with a figure called Ragnar, forced King Charles the Bald to pay a substantial ransom. This mattered because it exposed the vulnerability of even major inland capitals and demonstrated that river systems provided direct access to political centers. However, continuous confrontation proved costly for both sides. Frankish rulers faced repeated devastation of agricultural regions and trade hubs, while Viking leaders required stable bases of operation to sustain long-term presence. The solution emerged in 911, when the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted land around the lower Seine to the Viking leader Rollo in exchange for loyalty and defense against further raids. This agreement, recorded in later sources though, with debated specifics, established what became known as Normandy. This mattered because it transformed a raiding threat into a territorial ally. Land grants converted external pressure into internal defense. Normandy developed rapidly into a powerful duchy, integrated into the Frankish feudal system. Rollo and his successors adopted Christianity and the French language within a few generations. Yet they retained elements of Scandinavian martial organization and maritime expertise. This mattered because cultural assimilation did not erase institutional continuity. The Normans combined Norse military traditions with Frankish administrative models, creating a hybrid political structure capable of expansion. By the 11th century, Norman rulers extended influence beyond France. The most prominent example is William of Normandy's conquest of England in 1066. This event represents a layered consequence of Viking expansion. Scandinavian raiders became French-speaking Christian dukes who then reshaped English governance through feudal reorganization. This mattered because it demonstrates how Viking migration indirectly altered the political architecture of Western Europe across centuries. The legacy of a 9th century land grant reverberated into a transformative conquest. Continental Europe also experienced defensive reforms in response to Viking pressure. River fortifications were strengthened, bridge systems constructed to block naval passage, and local militias reorganized. In some regions, tribute payments, known as Danegeld, were used to buy temporary peace. While costly, such payments sometimes redirected Viking fleets elsewhere. This mattered because adaptation reduced the long-term effectiveness of raiding. As defenses improved and territories stabilized, opportunistic attacks became less profitable. In the Baltic region, Scandinavian expansion intersected with Slavic and Finno-Ugric societies. Trade centers developed around the Baltic Sea, linking northern Europe with river routes to the east. Over time, Scandinavian kingdoms themselves participated in Christian crusading campaigns against pagan Baltic groups during the 12th century. This represented a reversal of earlier dynamics. Former raiders now operated as state-backed military forces within the broader European Christian framework. This mattered because it shows that Viking expansion ultimately fed into continental consolidation rather than permanent destabilization. The continental impact of the Vikings was therefore not limited to destruction. It included negotiated settlements, hybrid political structures, and institutional reforms that strengthened medieval states. The next phase will examine how Viking activity influenced economic systems and long-distance trade across Europe and beyond, reinforcing the shift from plunder to structured commerce. Beyond warfare and settlement, one of the most enduring legacies of the Viking Age was the restructuring of trade networks across northern and eastern Europe. Scandinavian merchants connected previously distant regions through maritime and riverine corridors that linked the North Atlantic, the Baltic, the British Isles, and the Islamic world. This mattered because economic integration often outlasts political conquest. Even after large-scale raiding declined, the trade infrastructure built during the Viking Age continued to shape medieval commerce. In the Baltic region, trading hubs such as Hedeby in present-day Germany, Birka in Sweden, and later Visby on the island of Gotland functioned as exchange centers for goods moving between east and west. These towns were not temporary camps, but structured settlements with workshops, warehouses, and defined market areas. Archaeological evidence shows standardized weights and measures used for bullion transactions, reflecting regulated commercial practice. This mattered because it demonstrates that Viking merchants operated within increasingly sophisticated economic systems rather than relying solely on opportunistic plunder. The river routes connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea enabled the flow of silver from the Abbasid Caliphate into northern Europe. Hordes of Islamic dorms found in Scandinavia attest to sustained commercial exchange during the 9th and 10th centuries. Silver functioned as both currency and raw material for ornamentation. This mattered because it tied Scandinavian economies to global trade networks, stretching far beyond Europe. Viking expansion was not isolated regional activity. It intersected with transcontinental markets. In Western Europe, trade between Scandinavian settlements and local populations fostered economic interdependence. York, under Norse control, became a thriving commercial center, producing metal goods, textiles, and imported items. In Dublin, initially founded as a Viking base, trade expanded to include slaves, furs, and luxury products. These urban centers linked Ireland and England to continental markets. This mattered because economic cooperation replaced continuous hostility. Even former adversaries benefited from exchange relationships. Maritime technology played a central role in sustaining these networks. Longships enabled rapid transport and flexible navigation, while broader narrow-type cargo ships were designed specifically for carrying goods across open seas. The distinction between raiding vessel and merchant vessel became increasingly pronounced. This mattered because specialization reflects economic maturation. As commerce expanded, ship design adapted to optimize cargo capacity rather than speed alone. Over time, the economic systems shaped during the Viking Age fed into larger European commercial organizations. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Hanseatic League emerged as a dominant Baltic trading network. While the League developed after the formal end of the Viking Age, it built upon maritime routes and commercial practices established earlier. Scandinavian ports remained integral to this system. This mattered because Viking-era connectivity laid groundwork for later institutional trade alliances. The transformation from plunder-based acquisition to regulated trade reflects a broader pattern in Viking history. Initial expansion often relied on violence, but long-term stability required cooperation in infrastructure. As European states strengthened and markets expanded, the profitability of sustained trade exceeded that of risky raids. The economic legacy of the Vikings thus became embedded within the medieval commercial framework of Northern Europe. The final phase of this act will examine how these political and economic changes influenced the North Atlantic settlements and the long-term trajectory of Scandinavian societies beyond the traditional Viking Age. The long-term impact of Viking expansion is particularly visible in the North Atlantic settlements, where demographic, environmental, and economic patterns reveal both adaptation and limitation. Iceland, settled in the late 9th century, developed into a stable agrarian society with a distinctive legal and literary culture. The Alhingi continued functioning for centuries, and Iceland became a center for saga writing in the 12th and 13th centuries. This mattered because it preserved detailed historical memory of the Viking Age and shaped modern understanding of the period. Unlike Greenland or Vinland, Iceland's environment, though harsh, supported sustainable livestock farming when carefully managed. Greenland presents a contrasting trajectory. Established in the late 10th century, its settlements endured for approximately 4 centuries but eventually disappeared by the 15th century. Scholars point to a combination of factors: climatic cooling during the Little Ice Age, overgrazing and soil erosion, declining European demand for walrus ivory, and increasing isolation as Norwegian shipping routes weakened. This mattered because it highlights the environmental and economic fragility of remote colonies. Viking expansion succeeded when supported by viable trade networks and adaptable agricultural systems. When those systems deteriorated, sustainability faltered. The Norse presence in North America, confirmed archaeologically at Ellen-Seox Meadows, left no lasting colony. However, its significance lies in demonstrating the geographic reach of medieval European navigation centuries before Columbus. This mattered because it revises assumptions about the limits of early transatlantic travel. Although the Norse did not establish permanent settlement, their voyages illustrate both maritime capability and the importance of economic incentives in sustaining expansion. Without stable trade integration, Vinland could not be maintained. In Scandinavia itself, the transition from decentralized raiding culture to centralized monarchy reshaped identity. Maritime skill remained central, but it was redirected toward commerce, royal administration, and participation in broader European conflicts. Scandinavian kingdoms became contributors to continental politics rather than external disruptors. This mattered because the Viking Age was not a permanent state of society. It was a phase driven by specific structural conditions that evolved over time. The cultural legacy of the Vikings endured through language, place names, legal traditions, and literary memory. In England, Norse vocabulary remains embedded in everyday speech. In Normandy, descendants of Norse settlers reshaped medieval European power structures. In Eastern Europe, the Rus polity influenced the later histories of Russia and Ukraine. These outcomes demonstrate that Viking expansion left institutional and demographic marks far beyond its original Scandinavian core. This mattered because long-term influence often exceeds short-term spectacle. The raids that shocked monasteries were dramatic, but the settlements that followed carried deeper structural consequences. By the end of the 11th century, the Viking Age had transitioned fully into the medieval state system of Europe. The same maritime networks that once enabled sudden coastal attacks now facilitated regulated trade and diplomatic exchange. The transformation from raiders to traders and settlers was complete, embedded within kingdoms, cities, and cultural identities that continued to evolve long after the longships ceased arriving unannounced on foreign shores. By the time the Viking Age concluded, much of what later generations would know about the Vikings was shaped not only by contemporary records, but by texts written centuries afterward. This matters because our understanding of the Vikings depends heavily on the nature and timing of available sources. Early written accounts, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or Frankish Annals, were produced by Christian observers who experienced raids firsthand. These records emphasize destruction, sacrilege, and sudden violence. They provide valuable chronological anchors, but they reflect the perspective of victims rather than participants. In contrast, many of the detailed narratives about Viking leaders and explorers come from Icelandic sagas written in the 12th and 13th centuries. These include Heimskringla, the Saga of the Greenlanders, and the Saga of Eric the Red. Although grounded in earlier oral tradition, they were composed long after the events they describe. This matters because the sagas combine historical memory with literary construction. They preserve genealogies, political sequences, and geographic knowledge, but they also shape characters into dramatic figures suited for storytelling. For example, Ragnar Lothbrok appears prominently in later tradition as a major Viking leader responsible for raids across England and Francia. However, contemporary 9th century sources do not clearly confirm his existence as described in saga literature. Some historians suggest Ragnar may represent a composite figure drawn from multiple historical leaders. This matters because distinguishing between documented individuals and legendary synthesis is essential for accurate historical reconstruction. The Viking Age included real campaigns and rulers, but not every named hero in later texts can be verified. Archaeology provides a separate line of evidence that often clarifies or challenges written tradition. Excavations at sites such as York, Dublin, Hedeby, and Lanso Meadows supply material confirmation of settlement, trade, and craftsmanship. Burial sites reveal social stratification and cultural exchange. For instance, grave goods combining Scandinavian and local styles illustrate integration rather than strict cultural isolation. This matters because physical evidence anchors interpretation. Where written sources exaggerate or omit, material findings offer corrective balance. Runestones across Scandinavia also contribute contemporary testimony. These carved memorial stones, often commemorating individuals who traveled or died abroad, provide names, kinship connections, and sometimes references to expeditions. While brief, they confirm patterns of mobility and overseas activity. This matters because runestones represent near-contemporary Scandinavian voices. Unlike many later saga compilations, they reveal how communities remembered participation in expeditions during the Viking Age itself. Modern scholarship synthesizes these varied sources: hostile chronicles, saga literature, archaeology, and epigraphy. To reconstruct a balanced account, no single category of evidence is sufficient alone. Christian chroniclers emphasize violence. Sagas dramatize leadership. Archaeology documents economic and social realities. This matters because historical understanding requires triangulation. Only by comparing perspectives can historians separate mythologized heroism from verifiable structure. The enduring popular image of the Viking horned helmet, relentless warrior, singularly violent, largely originates from 19th century romantic nationalism rather than medieval reality. The next phase will examine how modern reinterpretations reshaped the Viking image and why separating romantic myth from documented history remains important for understanding the period accurately. By the 19th century, nearly 800 years after the end of the Viking Age, the image of the Viking underwent significant reinterpretation. This mattered because much of what modern audiences imagine when they hear the word Viking was shaped, not by medieval sources, but by later cultural movements. Romantic nationalism in Scandinavia and elsewhere sought heroic ancestral narratives to strengthen emerging national identities. The Viking became a symbol of strength, exploration, and independence, often stripped of historical complexity. One of the most persistent misconceptions, the horned helmet, did not originate in the Viking Age itself. No archaeological evidence supports the routine use of horned helmets in Scandinavian warfare during the 8th to 11th centuries. The image became popularized through 19th century costume design, particularly in operatic productions such as Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle. This mattered because visual representation can override historical accuracy. Once embedded in cultural imagery, such symbols endure even when contradicted by material evidence. Romantic-era historians and artists emphasized the adventurous and heroic aspects of Viking voyage, portraying them as proto-national pioneers rather than participants in complex economic and political systems. Exploration of Iceland, Greenland, and North America was celebrated as proof of northern ingenuity and maritime superiority. While these voyages were historically significant, the narrative often minimized the roles of trade, integration, and adaptation that defined much of Viking expansion. This mattered because selective emphasis distorts proportional understanding. The Viking Age included violence and exploration, but it also included administration, diplomacy, and cultural blending. In the 20th century, reinterpretation continued through popular media, academic revision, and political appropriation. Archaeology advanced significantly, refining timelines and clarifying settlement patterns. At the same time, extremist groups occasionally misused Viking symbols to promote exclusionary ideologies. This mattered because historical imagery can be detached from context and repurposed for modern agendas. Responsible scholarship emphasizes complexity and rejects simplistic glorification. Modern media representations, films, television series, and novels have further shaped public perception. These portrayals often amplify dramatic conflict while compressing chronology or merging historical figures. Although such depictions increase interest in the period, they frequently blur distinctions between documented events and narrative invention. This matters because entertainment-driven storytelling can overshadow evidence-based reconstruction. The balance between accessibility and accuracy remains a continuing challenge. Academic research over the past several decades has shifted emphasis towards social history, gender roles, trade systems, and environmental adaptation. Studies of isotopic analysis, DNA evidence, and burial patterns reveal that Viking communities were more diverse and interconnected than earlier stereotypes suggested. Women participated in trade and property management. Individuals of mixed ancestry appear in burial sites across the North Atlantic and Baltic. This mattered because it complicates earlier assumptions of homogeneous warrior bands. Viking society was structured, stratified, and integrated into broader networks. Understanding how the Viking image evolved across centuries is essential for separating historical evidence from cultural projection. The next phase will consolidate this analysis by examining what remains historically secure about it, Viking activity, and what continues to invite debate among scholars today. After more than a century of sustained archaeological excavation and textual analysis, historians can identify several core conclusions about the Viking Age with strong confidence. First, the period traditionally dated from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century was marked by sustained Scandinavian mobility across Europe and the North Atlantic. This mobility was enabled by advanced shipbuilding techniques, particularly clinker-built vessels capable of both oceanic and river navigation. This matters because maritime technology is not speculative. Physical ship remains such as the Oseberg and Gokstad ships provide concrete evidence of construction methods and navigational capability. Second, it is firmly established that Viking groups engaged in both raiding and structured trade. Contemporary annals document attacks on monasteries and cities, while archaeological finds confirm extensive commercial exchange with regions as distant as the Abbasid Caliphate. Silver hoards, standardized weights, and imported goods found in Scandinavian contexts demonstrate sustained economic integration. This matters because it dispels the outdated assumption that Viking expansion was purely predatory. Violence and commerce operated simultaneously, often through the same networks. Third, settlement patterns in England, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Eastern Europe are archaeologically verifiable. Place name evidence, material culture, burial customs, and DNA analysis confirm demographic influence. In the case of Valense, Oaks Meadows, physical structures and artifacts definitively established Norse presence in North America around the year 1000. This matters because it anchors saga traditions and tangible reality, even if narrative details remain embellished. However, several aspects of Viking history remain debated. The exact motivations behind early expansion continue to generate scholarly discussion. Some emphasize internal political consolidation and inheritance pressures. Others highlight economic incentives linked to expanding trade routes. Still others note climatic factors that may have facilitated agricultural surplus. This matters because complex historical processes rarely have a single cause. Expansion likely resulted from overlapping economic, political, and environmental dynamics rather than one dominant trigger. Individual figures also remain subject to uncertainty. Leaders such as Ragnar Lothbrok occupy a space between legend and potential historical memory. While large-scale campaigns associated with his name are documented, direct contemporary confirmation of his biography is limited. Similarly, the details surrounding early Rus leadership, including Rurik and Oleg, rely heavily on later chronicles. This matters because distinguishing verifiable events from later narrative construction requires careful source comparison and acknowledgement of uncertainty. The scale and composition of Viking forces are also debated. Written sources often exaggerate numbers, especially when describing invasions or sieges. Archaeology suggests variability in force size, depending on context, from small raiding crews to larger coordinated armies, such as the Great Heathen Army. This matters because realistic assessment of manpower affects understanding of logistics, strategy, and political organization. Despite these uncertainties, the broad structure of the Viking Age is well established. Initial raiding, expansion into trade and settlement, political integration, and eventual transformation within centralized Christian monarchies. The final part of this act will consolidate the historical record into a clear summary of what the Viking Age ultimately represents within European and global history. When the evidence from chronicles, archaeology, linguistic study, and environmental data is considered together, the Viking Age emerges not as a period defined solely by violence, but as a phase of accelerated connectivity across northern Eurasia and the North Atlantic. The initial raids drew attention because they disrupted established religious and political centers, yet the long-term consequences were structural rather than episodic. This matters because historical significance is measured not only by immediate shock, but by durable transformation. The Viking Age altered trade routes, settlement patterns, state formation processes, and cultural exchange across multiple regions. In England, Viking incursions contributed to administrative reform and political consolidation. The Danelaw reshaped local governance, and Norse vocabulary became permanently embedded in the English language. In Francia, negotiated settlement produced Normandy, whose rulers later reconfigured English and Mediterranean politics. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian elites integrated into Slavic societies, contributing to the formation of Kievan Rus and its diplomatic alignment with Byzantium. In the North Atlantic, Iceland developed a unique legal culture, while Greenland demonstrated both the reach and limits of medieval expansion. This matters because each region adapted differently, yet all reflect interaction rather than simple domination. The Viking Age also illustrates how mobility can accelerate institutional change. Scandinavian societies that once relied on decentralized chieftains transitioned into centralized monarchies, integrated into Christian Europe. Maritime technology that enabled sudden coastal raids later supported regulated trade and diplomatic exchange. This matters because it highlights adaptability. The same skills that fueled expansion were redirected toward state building and economic stabilization once political conditions shifted. Importantly, the Vikings did not exist outside the medieval world. They were participants in it. Their expansion intersected with the Carolingian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and emerging Slavic polities. Silver from Baghdad circulated in Swedish markets. Norse warriors served in Constantinople. Norman descendants shaped feudal Europe. This matters because it situates the Viking Age within global medieval dynamics rather than isolating it as a northern anomaly. The enduring fascination with the Vikings often centers on their dramatic raids or legendary heroes, but the more significant historical narrative lies in transformation within 3 centuries. Scandinavian societies moved from fragmented chiefdoms, launching opportunistic expeditions, to organized kingdoms embedded in continental systems of law, religion, and commerce. The Viking Age was therefore a transitional period, a bridge between late antiquity and high medieval Europe and the northern world. As we conclude the master acts, the final act will provide a clear closing synthesis, tracing the arc from raiders to traders to settlers, and assessing how this transformation continues to influence modern historical understanding. When we trace the Viking Age from its recorded beginning in 793 to its symbolic conclusion in 1066, a clear progression emerges. The period did not begin with empire building or colonization. It began with targeted coastal raids made possible by maritime innovation and political fragmentation. The attack on Lindisfarne was not the creation of a civilization in motion, but the visible signal of one that already possessed the tools and motivations for expansion. This matters because the Viking Age did not erupt from isolation. It developed from existing trade connections, competitive chieftain politics, and shipbuilding expertise that had matured over generations. The first phase emphasized speed and surprise. Small crews targeted exposed religious and commercial sites where wealth was concentrated and defenses were minimal. These raids generated silver, prestige, and leverage within Scandinavian power structures. However, repeated success exposed larger strategic possibilities. As river systems were explored and coastal vulnerabilities mapped, expeditions increased in scale. The Great Heathen Army in England marked the transition from episodic raiding to organized territorial ambition. This mattered because it introduced the concept of permanence. Once Vikings overwintered, fortified positions, and negotiated treaties, they ceased to be temporary disruptors and became political actors. Settlement followed opportunity. In England, the Danelaw institutionalized Scandinavian authority across broad territories. In Ireland, towns like Dublin evolved from encampments into economic hubs. In Francia, negotiated land grants produced Normandy, a duchy that would later alter European history through conquest and governance. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian elites became integrated into the formation of the Rus polity, connecting the Baltic to Byzantium and the Islamic world. In the North Atlantic, Iceland demonstrated successful migration without monarchy, while Greenland and Vinland illustrated both reach and the limits of expansion. This matters because the Viking Age cannot be reduced to violence alone. It included administration, law, trade, and adaptation to diverse environments. Over time, internal developments within Scandinavia altered the expansion dynamic. Centralized monarchies emerged, Christianization integrated kingdoms into continental Europe, and regulated trade replaced opportunistic plunder as the dominant economic model. Maritime expertise remained central, but it served different purposes. Kings commanded fleets for defense and diplomacy rather than leaving initiative to independent sea kings. This mattered because structural incentives changed. When wealth could be generated through stable trade and taxation, the risks of large-scale raiding became less rational. By the 11th century, the Viking Age had transitioned into a new political reality. Scandinavian kingdoms were no longer marginal actors striking outward. They were established members of the medieval European state system. The arc from raiders to traders to settlers had completed its course, The final part will consolidate this transformation and close the narrative with a clear assessment of what the Viking Age ultimately contributed to European and global history. The Viking Age represents a concentrated period of outward movement driven by maritime capability, competitive leadership structures, and access to vulnerable trade corridors. Its beginning was marked by raids that exposed weaknesses in coastal Europe, but its defining legacy lies in the systems that emerged afterward. Raiding opened doors, yet settlement, governance, and integration sustained influence. This matters because historical phases are measured not by their most dramatic moments, but by the durability of their consequences. The Vikings altered demographic patterns in England and Ireland, contributed to the formation of Normandy and Kievan Rus, expanded maritime routes across the North Atlantic, and accelerated political consolidation within Scandinavia itself. In structural terms, the Viking Age demonstrates how mobility interacts with opportunity. Scandinavian societies possessed advanced ship technology at a time when neighboring regions were politically fragmented and economically concentrated in accessible sites. This alignment created a window for rapid expansion. As European states strengthened defenses, improved fortifications, and consolidated power, that window narrowed. Simultaneously, Scandinavia's own monarchies centralized authority, redirected military capacity, and embraced Christianity. This mattered because expansion is rarely permanent. It depends on shifting balances of power, technology, and economic incentive. The transition from decentralized raiding bands to recognized kingdoms embedded within Christendom illustrates adaptive capacity. Vikings, who once attacked monasteries, later founded bishop. Leaders who once extracted tribute became monarchs collecting taxes. Descendants of Scandinavian settlers in Normandy reshaped England and Mediterranean politics. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian elites blended into Slavic societies, influencing state formation without preserving a distinct Norse identity. In Iceland, a stateless assembly system preserved legal continuity for centuries. These outcomes vary, yet they share a common pattern: transformation through integration rather than indefinite domination. Geographically, Viking expansion connected regions that had previously interacted only intermittently. Silva from the Islamic world circulated in Scandinavian markets. Norse warriors served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. Atlantic navigation reached Greenland and North America centuries before later European voyages. This mattered because the Viking Age expanded the operational map of medieval Europe. It intensified contact between North and South, East and West, accelerating exchange across political and cultural boundaries. When the period ended around the mid-11th century, it did so not through collapse, but through absorption. The practices that defined the era were incorporated into emerging state systems. Maritime skill persisted, but under royal command. Trade networks matured into structured commercial alliances. Cultural memory preserved the exploits of earlier generations through saga literature, even as Christian monarchies redefined identity. The Viking Age therefore stands as a transitional bridge between localized chiefdom societies and integrated medieval kingdoms. If you've followed this journey from the fjords of Scandinavia to the rivers of Russia and the shores of North America, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It supports detailed historical narratives like this one. In the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And after hearing the full story, which phase do you find most significant? The raids, the settlements, or the political transformation that followed? This concludes our full account of the Vikings, raiders, traders, and settlers.